All right, so the heading for this section of notes is Chapter 2, Section 2. That's what the heading of your notes should be. And we're still continuing to talk about the origins of American government. Here's some objectives for the lesson. These are key terms, so definite words and definitions that you may need to look back at when you have assignments. So the introductions, what events and ideas led to American independence? Some of these are some things you could have answered for your focus question for today. Unpopular British colonial policies, such as taxation without representation, growing political unity among the colonies, colonial protests, and British efforts to punish colonies for showing independence. All of those could have been things you answered for your focus question. So your first heading for your notes is British colonial policies. The colonies became used to self-rule, so they became used to ruling themselves. The distance made it hard for the British Parliament to manage the colonies. Or enforce the laws. The colonial legislators took on broader powers. That's something you should know. The colonial legislators, so the colonial, another word for legislators is lawmakers. So the lawmakers of the colonies took on broader powers without such an example as withholding pay from the governors that were appointed by the king if they disagreed with their policies. At this time, Britain provided colonial defense. So they provided defense for the colonies. They managed the foreign affairs. And they also provided currency, which is what? Money. At this time, the taxes or the taxation was low and interference was minimal. So Britain was taking a very hands-off approach to the colonies during this time. So there wasn't a lot of unrest or issues. Your next heading for your notes should be the British policy changes. British policy changes. So some changes were made, which is what created a lot of the problems. So the problems began after when King George III came to power, which was in 1760. He enacted British policy changes. What that did was that it meant that Parliament, which remember is the form of government in Britain, Parliament expanded and enforced laws to control the colonies' trade. Parliament passed new taxes to pay for British troops stationed in North America. The colonists had no say in these policies and protested taxation without representation. That's the part you need to know. That's a very common saying during this time, that colonists felt that they were being taxed, but they weren't being represented in Britain's government. They were just having to pay for it, but they weren't being represented in Parliament. So that led to British leaders ignoring them. The British leaders ignored the complaints of the colonists. Your next heading is the early efforts at unity. So the colonies wanted to try to unite, or certain leaders of the colonies wanted the colonies to unite, but the early efforts failed. Benjamin Franklin proposed the Albany Plan of Union. So you need to know that it was, the first one was the Albany Plan of Union, and that was in 1754. It would have created a Congress for the colonies, but what happened? It was rejected by the colonies. The colonies did not agree. They did not all agree to become part of this Albany Congress. So then just a little while later, in 1765, Britain passed the Stamp Act. What was the Stamp Act? It was a law that required a stamp to be bought for all legal documents and newspapers. As you can guess, that Stamp Act did not sit well with the colonists. So your next heading, the Stamp Act Congress. So 9 of the 13 colonies responded to the Stamp Act by forming the Stamp Act Congress. What did they do? They sent a Declaration of Rights and grievances to King George. This was the first unified colonial protest. So what did King George and Parliament do? Parliament repealed the Stamp Act. They took it away. But then your new heading, as you can see, tensions still grew. So what is tension? It's like anger or issues. And that began to grow because new laws continued to be enacted. And they angered the colonists. What did the colonists do? They responded with boycotts and violence. Over here in these pictures, you can see some of the boycotts that they chose, some political cartoons at that time that were being put out. The colonists created committees of correspondence to organize resistance. So the colonists began to organize their resistance to these new laws that were being enacted by Britain and Parliament. So some famous events that you've probably heard of in your history classes before, the Boston Massacre and the Boston Tea Party, continued to raise the tensions between the colonists and Britain. Your next heading, the First Continental Congress. You can always abbreviate first with the number. What was the First Continental Congress? Well, it met in Philadelphia in 1774, and it was in response to the acts from Britain. It included delegates or representatives from every colony but Georgia. Among them were some famous names like John Adams, George Washington, John Jay. What did the First Continental Congress do? Again, they sent a Declaration of Rights to King George that protested Britain's colonial policies. So all of these laws and policies that were being enacted, they sent this declaration to the king to explain or to let him know that they were unhappy with these practices and these policies. The First Continental Congress also urged the colonists to boycott trade with England. until these laws were taken away or repealed. And then by the end of the First Continental Congress, they gained the support of all 13 colonial legislators, or all 13 colonies. And when they adjourned that First Continental Congress, they went ahead and set a date for a second Congress to meet the following May, to follow up on what had happened and what they have discussed in the first one. So your next heading, of course, is going to be now the Second Continental Congress. It met in Philadelphia in 1775. This time, every colony, all 13 colonies, sent a delegate or a representative. John Hancock was chosen as president of the Congress, so you'll know John Hancock's name. He was the first person to sign the Constitution, and people will say things like, write your John Hancock down. That means to write your name, because he was the first person to write his name on the Constitution when it was finally created. During this time, in 1775, the Revolutionary War had already started. The battles of Lexington and Concord had already been fought, and war had already now been declared. So at this Second Continental Congress, an army was created, because they had to have an army to fight King George's army. So an army was created, and George Washington was made the commander-in-chief of that army. So you don't need a new heading. This is continuing the Second Continental Congress. The Second Continental Congress became America's first national government. So this was before the Constitution was written. The Second Continental Congress became America's first national government. It lasted from 1776 to 1781. It had legislative and executive powers. During the war, the Revolutionary War, it raised a military, printed and borrowed money, and made foreign treaties. That means that they made deals with other countries, such as France or Spain. They began to make dealings with other countries to help them fight King George and England's army. And then here's a picture of Benjamin Franklin. He was a leading member of the Second Continental Congress. He was very involved in the early beginnings of America's independence. Your next section, or your next heading, is Breaking from Britain. So after a while of fighting and having a war and meeting with Congress, the Continental Congress resolved to break away from Britain in 1776. Some popular names: Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Robert Livingston, Thomas Jefferson. They were all named to write a proclamation of independence. So you don't have to know their names, but people were chosen to write a proclamation of independence from Britain, or Britain's rule. The delegates, again, or representatives from the colonies, declared independence on July 2nd of 1776 and adopted the declaration that was written, the Proclamation of Independence. They adopted the declaration on July 4th. That's why we celebrate Independence Day on July 4th, because we declared and officially adopted independence on July 4th of 1776. So new heading, the Declaration of Independence.